I'm going to read some more from the Talmud Jmmanuel, chapter 3. Explanation. Pharisees. Pharisee, from Hebrew, equals ha-harushim, the separated. In Judaism, the Pharisees represent a religious, political movement which arose in the 2nd century before Jmmanuel, BC, from the religious group of the pious, in more as a pragmatic, or practically acting and contemplative school of thought. Cassadar, on Mark 7:13. The Pharisees were in a middle position between the Saddusees and the eschatologically oriented groups, some of which having strong political and radical ambitions. In Palestinian Judaism, at the time of Jmmanuel, they formed a group that enjoyed very high esteem. The Pharisees, in contrast to the temple aristocracy of the Sadducees, represented a lay movement, which placed a very high value on the study of the Holy Scriptures. Their realistic, liberal interpretation of the Jewish laws was a particular characteristic of theirs. And besides the Torah, teaching, instruction, law, set out in the Pentateuch, 5 scrolls, books of Moses, they also determined the oral tradition to be binding. They also saw their adapting to the Hellenized environment while preserving their religious identity to be right. The Pharisees, together with the Sadducees, formed the High Council, Sanhedrin. With regard to the Roman occupation, they took an actual political stance. Consequently, the radical wing of the zealots, religious zealots, fanatics, equals a radical anti-Roman Old Jewish party in Old Judaism, separated from the Pharisees in the 6th century Jmmanuel AD. With regard to their theology, they advocated ideas that went beyond the Hebrew Bible, as for example the hope of resurrection, contrary to the Sadducees, Acts 23:6 ff, as well as the expectation of the final judgment. With regard to the final judgment, they believed that through the strict fulfilling of the Torah, they could obtain the compassion of God and stand before him. Towards the Pharisees, a very one-sided, critical form of polemics, that is, harsh verbal attacks, was practiced, particularly with the reproach of outward legalism and self-righteousness. This is also reflected in Jewish sources as well as in the New Testament. Thus, it is not surprising that Jmmanuel was very critical of them and reprimanded them. When Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 Jmmanuel AD, as a consequence, the Pharisees, as bearers of rabbinic, rabbi equals Jewish religion, teacher, scribe, Judaism, then determined the development of overall Judaism. Consequently, their teaching views have also found their expression in rabbinic, Talmudic literature. See Hebrew explanation. Sadducees. Sadducees in Hebrew equals of Zadok. With the Sadducees, it concerns a Jewish religious party and a religious political party that formed in the 2nd century before Jmmanuel, before Christ. Their followers grouped themselves from the ranks of aristocratic landowners as well as from the priestly leading elite. As a result, a special significance position was assigned to them in the temple and in the Sanhedrin, High Council. From this elite, there also came several high priests. Theologically speaking, they were more conservative, and thus the Sadducees saw God's will, above all, take effect in the cult order. Consequently, they also fanatically defended their continuance as the basis of their social position. They strongly emphasized the exclusive focus on the Torah, but, contrary to the Pharisees, vehemently rejected the oral tradition as well as certain theological developments. The absence of eschatological imaginations, that is, the teaching or totality of religious imaginations of the last things, i.e., of the final destiny of the individual human being in the world, eschatology, was characteristic of the Sadducees, as well as the rejection of belief in the resurrection. They also rejected individual providence and guidance by God or angels, as well as the emphasis on human willpower. Politically speaking, the Sadducees were, to a large extent, willing to cooperate with Rome. When the revolt against Rome took place from 66 to 70 Jmmanuel AD, they were severely decimated by the Zealots and Sadducees, radical Jewish group, whose members were always armed with a dagger. When the destruction of the temple occurred in 70 Jmmanuel AD, the Sadducees very quickly lost their cultic and economic means of existence. Explanation: Scribes. The scribes in early Judaism were academics in relation to the religion, who distinguished themselves by a thorough knowledge of the religious traditions, particularly with regard to the laws. The scribes, as Jewish academics, were also valid as leaders of the synagogues and as legal advisors at the same time as judges and often as a local council. Since the time of the Babylonian captivity at Ezra's time, the term scribes is the designation for the Jewish teachers of the law. Ezra 7:11. In the New Testament, they are repeatedly mentioned with a criticizing intention, together with the Pharisees. For example, in Matthew 23 and Mark 7:5 ff. 10. But Johannes, the initiator, the one who carries out the initiation, spoke, quote, "You brood of adders, who told you that you will escape from the future wrath of the disciples who are pious, faithful towards you, once your false and confused teachings become recognized by them?" 11. See to it that you bear righteous fruit of repentance and comprehend, learn the truth of all truth, as is taught by the teaching of the prophets. 12. Turn away from the evil of your confused teachings, which you carry out with arrogance and pursuant with your greed for might and treasures. 13. Do not think just of saying to each other, quote, "We have Abraham as father." 14. I say to you, with his knowledge and with his power, the Ishwish is able to raise up children, which is only to be understood symbolically. Out of these stones, because he is wise about the secret of the creation and its laws. 15. Already the axe has been laid at the root of the trees. Therefore, any tree that does not bring forth good fruit will be hewn down or honed down and thrown into the fire, and such will happen to you as your own descendants. 16. You brood of adders, in 2 times 1,000 years you and your descendants, who pursue their false and confused teachings out of your own haughtiness and your greed for might and treasures, will be summoned and on account of your lies punished. 17. So it will be when the human species will know, and when the chaff is separated from the grain, so will it happen in the places of the world, in all places of the world. It will be at the time when many of your confused teachings are laughed at, and every human species discovers the truth, which can be given in reality alone, and thus in the laws and recommendations of the creation. It's 19. This will come to pass when the human species see the singing, whirring lights, extraterrestrial beam ships again, and when the human being builds ships, aircraft that fly, and chariots of fire, rockets that move away, shoot into the firmament, outer space, as is done by the Ishwish and his followers, he and the celestial sons, extraterrestrials, 20. So thus the distant descendants of those who already at an early time brought and taught us the wisdom and knowledge of the creation, 21. The descendants of those of our ancestors who suggested to us that we should follow the extensive, comprehensive laws of nature and live by them, because even these are the laws of the creation, 22. O you secessionists, you brood of adders, you brood of adders, get away from this place, because you are unclean, and you will be cursed, smitten with errors and evils, and insulted by the human beings on account of your confused teachings. 23. Get away from this place, because I can, by my own accord, bring you to repentance, only with the old custom of initiation. But he who comes after me is stronger than I, and I cannot be worthy of removing his shoes, which is the last in the line of the Nocademian spirit form, which is Edward Albert Meier, also known as Billy Edward Albert Meier, or Beam. He will bring you the initiation with the wisdom of spiritual knowledge and with the fire of truth. 24. He has his winnowing fork in his hand, and he will sweep his threshing floor and gather the wheat into his granary, but he will burn the chaff with the unquenchable fire of truth. I'm going to read that again. 24. He has his winnowing fork in his hand, and he will sweep his threshing floor and gather the wheat into his granary, but he will burn the chaff with the unquenchable fire of truth. Thank you for listening. Have a great afternoon, and Salome.